You know what happens when you question a three-star general's patriotism to his face? Especially when that general is George S. Patton, the most feared, most decorated, and straight-up most dangerous son of a gun the American Army ever produced? Well, buckle up, because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of raw, unfiltered military drama that Hollywood couldn't make up if they tried. Picture this: September 1944, somewhere in the war-torn fields of France. The Allied forces are watching one of the biggest military operations in history crumble into absolute chaos. Operation Market Garden Montgomery's brilliant plan to end the war by Christmas is turning into a bloodbath. British and American paratroopers are getting slaughtered in the Netherlands. Supplies aren't getting through, and the whole damn offensive is collapsing faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. And right there, in the middle of all this catastrophe, some British officer dressed all prim and proper in his perfectly pressed uniform has the absolute audacity, the unmitigated gall to look at General George S. Patton, Jr. and say those words, those fighting words. This operation proves American stupidity. Now, I want you to really let that sink in for a second. This wasn't some random comment at a tea party. This was a direct insult to American intelligence, American military capability, and American sacrifice said right to the face of a man who bled red, white, and blue, who believed in American superiority like it was gospel, and who had just spent the last several months absolutely demolishing German forces across France in what historians would later call one of the most spectacular military advances in modern warfare. The sheer disrespect of it all. The unbelievable nerve. What happened next? Man, what happened next is the stuff of absolute legend, and it tells you everything you need to know about who George Patton really was, what American pride meant in that era, and why some moments in history hit differently when you know the whole story. Before we dive deep into this absolute powder keg of a confrontation, I need you to do something for me real quick. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas? California? Maybe you're tuning in from overseas on a military base? I want to know, and here's the thing. If you love these kinds of untold stories, these raw moments from World War II that they don't teach you in school, these instances where real personalities and real drama shaped the course of history, then you absolutely need to smash that subscribe button right now. Hit that like button so hard your phone feels it, because we're digging into the archives and bringing you the most epic, most dramatic, most authentically American stories from the greatest generation. Give me your honest opinion in the comments about whether stories like this matter, whether we should keep telling them, and what other untold moments from World War II you want to hear about. Now, let's get back to it. To understand why this moment was so explosive, so potentially violent, so absolutely charged with tension that witnesses said you could practically see the electricity in the air, you've got to understand who George S. Patton was in September of 1944. This wasn't just any general. This wasn't some desk jockey who got his stars through politics and handshakes. George Smith Patton, Jr. was a certified warrior poet, a student of military history going back to the ancient Romans, a man who genuinely believed he had fought in past lives at battles throughout history, and someone who had spent his entire existence preparing for war like it was his divine calling. Old blood and guts, they called him. His men had another saying, too. Our blood, his guts, because Patton drove his soldiers harder than any commander in the European theater. But damn if he didn't get results. By September 1944, Patton's Third Army had done what many military experts thought was impossible. They had broken out of Normandy after D-Day, raced across France at speeds that made the Germans' heads spin, liberated countless French towns and cities, and were knocking on the door of Germany itself. His tanks were running out of gas, not because they were inefficient, but because they were moving so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. Patton's army had become a spearhead, slicing through Nazi defenses like a hot knife through butter, and the general himself had become a living legend, feared by the Germans who called him Der Blutige Patton, Bloody Patton. But here's where the politics come in, and politics in war can be just as deadly as bullets. The supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and EK had a nearly impossible job. He had to manage not just a military campaign, but the egos, the national interests, and the political realities of a massive coalition. The Americans were providing the majority of men and material by this point in the war, but the British still had enormous influence, and British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery Monty, to everyone who knew him, was both a legitimate military talent and an insufferable egotist who believed British military thinking was superior to the American approach. Montgomery had been pushing Eisenhower hard for a concentrated single-thrust approach into Germany, arguing that if he got the resources and priority, he could end the war quickly with one bold strike into the industrial heart of Germany. Patton, meanwhile, was advocating for his own approach. Give him the fuel and supplies, and he'd drive straight to Berlin before the Soviets could get there, ending the war on American terms. Eisenhower, trying to keep everyone happy and maintain coalition unity, had made a decision that frustrated the hell out of Patton. He gave Montgomery priority for resources and the green light for his big operation, Market Garden. This meant Patton's advance, which had been going spectacularly, had to slow down, had to wait, had to take a back seat while Montgomery got his chance to be the hero. Patton was furious, absolutely livid, but he was a soldier, and soldiers follow orders. So he sat there, watching his tanks run dry of fuel that was being diverted north to Montgomery, watching his momentum die, watching his opportunity to potentially end the war slip away, all while Montgomery prepared for what was supposed to be his masterstroke. Operation Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944, and it was ambitious as hell, maybe too ambitious. The plan was to drop tens of thousands of paratroopers behind German lines in the Netherlands to capture a series of bridges, while ground forces would rush up a single highway to link up with them, crossing the Rhine River and opening a path into Germany's industrial heartland. If it worked, it would be brilliant. If it failed, it would be catastrophic. And folks, it failed. It failed hard. The intelligence was bad. The Germans were stronger than expected. The single highway became a killing ground. The weather didn't cooperate. And the British paratroopers who dropped at the farthest bridge at Arnhem found themselves in a meat grinder, surrounded and outgunned. The operation that was supposed to end the war by Christmas instead became one of the costliest Allied failures of the entire European campaign, with thousands of elite paratroopers killed, wounded, or captured. And the entire time this disaster is unfolding, Patton is watching, knowing that his approach had been working, knowing that his army had been stopped to give Montgomery this chance, knowing that American soldiers are among those dying in this failed operation. The frustration, the vindication, the anger, it was all building up inside old blood and guts like a volcano ready to blow. So there's Patton, watching this whole debacle unfold, probably thinking I told you so with every fiber of his being, but keeping his mouth professionally shut, because that's what the chain of command demands when he gets invited, or maybe ordered, depending on whose account you believe, to attend a high-level briefing about the ongoing Market Garden situation. Now, you've got to picture the scene here. We're talking about a room full of top brass, American and British officers, all gathered around maps and intelligence reports, trying to figure out how to salvage what's quickly becoming an unsalvageable mess. The atmosphere is tense, because nobody wants to say out loud what everyone's thinking, that Montgomery's grand plan is falling apart and costing lives by the hour. Patton walks into this meeting, and you can bet every person in that room knows exactly what he's thinking, because Patton has never been subtle about his opinions. The man wore his emotions and his convictions on his sleeve like medals. He had that trademark steely gaze, those pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, yeah. He wore those even to briefings. Because Patton understood the power of image, of intimidation, of being a walking symbol of American martial prowess. His face was probably set in that expression his men knew all too well. The one that said he was biting his tongue, but just barely. The one that warned you not to poke the bear unless you wanted to see some real fireworks. The briefing goes on, officers discussing positions and casualties and logistics. And there's this underlying current of making excuses, of explaining away the failure without actually calling it a failure. Because nobody wants to directly insult Montgomery or the British contribution to the war effort, Allied unity, and all that political nonsense that Patton had absolutely zero patience for when American boys were dying. And that's when it happens. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, and we've got several because this moment became infamous enough that people remembered it vividly and talked about it for years afterward, this British officer, and historians have debated exactly who it was, though some accounts suggest it was one of Montgomery's own staff officers, makes a comment during the discussion. The exact wording varies, depending on who's telling the story, but the essence was captured consistently, this officer, in what might have been frustration, or defensiveness, or just spectacularly poor judgment, made a statement suggesting that the problems with Market Garden were at least partially due to American failures, American units not performing as needed, American stupidity in execution. Some versions have him saying something like, "This operation demonstrates the limitations of American tactical thinking," while others report the more direct and inflammatory, "This proves American stupidity." Either way, the meaning was crystal clear, and it landed in that room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Now I want you to understand something about the dynamics here. The American-British relationship in World War II was complicated as hell. On one hand, you had genuine partnership, shared sacrifice, and common cause against Nazi Germany. These nations were allies in the truest sense, and countless British and American soldiers fought and died side by side with mutual respect and brotherhood. But on the other hand, you had this underlying tension, this historical baggage, this rivalry between the British Empire, which was clearly in decline, but still acting like the premier world power, and the United States, which was rapidly becoming the actual premier world power, and wasn't shy about it. The British military establishment, particularly the old guard officers, sometimes looked down on the Americans as newcomers to the art of war, as lacking in the tradition and experience that the British forces had. Meanwhile, American officers, especially guys like Patton, who were intensely patriotic and confident in American exceptionalism, bristled at any suggestion that they were junior partners or somehow less capable. This cultural and professional tension was usually kept under wraps for the sake of the alliance, managed carefully by diplomats and senior commanders who understood that unity was essential for victory. But in moments of stress, in the wake of failure, when emotions were running high and the blame game started, that tension could surface real quick and real ugly. The second those words left the British officer's mouth, the temperature in that room dropped about 40 degrees. Witnesses said. Everyone who heard it knew instantly that a line had been crossed, that something unforgivable had just been said, and every eye in that room went straight to Patton, because everyone knew exactly what was coming. Old blood and guts didn't disappoint. According to the most detailed accounts, Patton went absolutely still. First, you know that moment before a storm hits, when everything goes quiet, and you just know hell is about to break loose. That, his face, normally stern, turned to stone, and his eyes, those famous intense blue eyes that could cut right through a man, locked onto that British officer like a targeting system, acquiring an enemy combatant. One witness described it as watching a panther spot prey, Another said it was like watching murder become a possibility in real time. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, and you could have heard a pin drop in that room, because everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see if Patton was going to explode, going to physically attack this officer, or what the hell was about to happen. And then Patton stood up, slowly, deliberately. He didn't jump up in rage. He rose to his feet with this terrifying, controlled precision that was somehow more intimidating than if he'd just lost his temper. He buttoned his jacket, because even in a moment of fury, Patton was conscious of military bearing and appearance, and he walked around the table toward this British officer. Now, everyone in that room is mentally calculating whether they're about to witness an international incident, whether they're going to have to physically restrain a 3-star American general from assaulting a British officer, whether World War III is about to start inside this briefing room before World War II is even finished. Patton stops right in front of this officer, close enough that they're almost nose to nose, and the height difference doesn't matter, because Patton's presence, his sheer force of personality and reputation, fills the entire space. And what does Patton say? Well, this is where it gets absolutely legendary, where the man's genius for psychological warfare and his deep understanding of history and military precedent comes into play, where you see why George S. Patton wasn't just a fighter, but a tactician of human nature itself. Patton stares at this British officer for what witnesses described as an uncomfortably long moment, letting the tension build, letting the fear and uncertainty work on everyone in that room, and then he speaks. But he doesn't yell, and this is crucial. This is what makes the moment so devastating. He doesn't raise his voice at all. Instead, he uses this low, controlled tone that's somehow more threatening than any amount of screaming could ever be. "Stand up," Patton says to the officer. And it's not a request. It's a command delivered with such authority that the British officer complies immediately, rising from his seat, even though Patton technically has no direct command authority over British personnel. That's the power of personality right there. That's the force of will that made Patton who he was. Now they're standing face to face, and Patton begins what can only be described as one of the most epic verbal destructions in military history. A masterclass in how to dismantle someone's argument, their pride, and their credibility without ever crossing the line into insubordination or creating an actual diplomatic crisis, because for all his reputation as a hothead, Patton was brilliant and politically savvy when he needed to be. American stupidity? Patton begins, his voice still low and controlled, but dripping with contempt. "You want to talk about American stupidity?" And then he launches into it. And folks, this is where you see the student of military history at work, where you see a man who had spent his entire life studying warfare from ancient times to the present day, who could quote Julius Caesar and Napoleon from memory, who understood military operations at a level that few of his contemporaries could match. Patton starts listing, methodically and precisely, every major American contribution to the war effort in Europe. He talks about D-Day, about how American forces stormed beaches like Omaha, where the casualties were catastrophic but the soldiers pushed through anyway, about how American blood soaked into French sand to establish the foothold that made everything else possible. He talks about the breakout from Normandy, about how his own Third Army had covered more ground in less time than any comparable military force in the entire war, liberating French territory at a pace that shocked even the most optimistic planners. He brings up logistics, talking about how American industrial might was supplying not just U.S. forces but British forces too, how American ships were bringing the material across the Atlantic, how American factories were producing the tanks and planes and guns that were making victory possible. But Patton doesn't stop there, oh no. He's just getting warmed up. He pivots to Market Garden itself, and this is where it gets really brutal, because now he's directly addressing the failure that prompted this whole confrontation. With witnesses hanging on every word, Patton methodically dissects the operation, pointing out every planning failure, every intelligence oversight, every logistical impossibility that was ignored in favor of optimism and ambition. He talks about the decision to drop paratroopers too far from their objectives, about the single highway approach that any first-year military academy student could tell you was a recipe for disaster, about the failure to properly scout German strength in the area, about the weather contingencies that weren't properly planned for. And here's the kicker: he does all this without once directly insulting Montgomery by name, without creating a direct diplomatic incident, but making it absolutely crystal clear that the failures of Market Garden had nothing to do with American stupidity and everything to do with British planning and British command decisions. One witness reported that Patton said something like, "When American soldiers are given a viable plan with proper support, they execute brilliantly, as we've proven from North Africa through Sicily to France. When they're given an impossible task with inadequate planning, even their courage and skill can't overcome fundamental strategic failures." The room is absolutely silent during this entire speech, and the British officer Patton is addressing has apparently gone pale, realizing he's made a catastrophic mistake in judgment by provoking this particular American general at this particular moment. Other British officers present are reportedly staring at the table or the walls, anywhere but at the confrontation, because they know Patton is right. They know Market Garden was flawed from conception, and they're not about to defend the indefensible just out of national pride. The American officers present are probably experiencing a mixture of emotions: professional concern about the potential fallout from this confrontation, but also undeniable pride in watching their general defend American honor and American soldiers so effectively and eloquently. Because that's what this moment was really about. Underneath all the tactical and strategic debate, it was about respect, about recognition of sacrifice, about refusing to let American soldiers be scapegoated for a British commander's failed plan. Patton then does something that shows his political sophistication, his understanding of how far he can push and when to pull back. After absolutely eviscerating the argument about American stupidity, after defending his soldiers and his country, he shifts his tone slightly. He acknowledges the bravery of British paratroopers at Arnhem, the courage of British soldiers throughout the war, and the genuine partnership between the Allied nations. He makes it clear that his issue isn't with British soldiers, or even with the British military in general, but with this specific operation, and specifically with anyone who would dare blame its failure on American inadequacy. It's a masterful rhetorical move, because it allows everyone in the room a face-saving exit from this confrontation. It prevents the incident from escalating into a full-blown crisis between the American and British command structures, but it also ensures that his central point, "Don't you ever question American capability or intelligence," lands with permanent impact. One account has Patton concluding with something like, "Our boys are dying together, British and American, and they deserve better than commanders pointing fingers across national lines when operations fail. They deserve honest assessment and better planning." The immediate aftermath of this confrontation is fascinating because it reveals the complex web of relationships and politics at the highest levels of military command. The British officer who made the original comment apparently offered some kind of apology or clarification, though accounts differ on exactly how sincere or complete it was. Other officers in the room quickly moved to defuse the situation, redirecting the conversation back to operational matters and away from national blame casting. Word of the incident spread rapidly through the command structure, as these things do, and reached Eisenhower's headquarters within days, if not hours. Eisenhower, who was always walking a tightrope between his American commanders and his British allies, who valued coalition unity above almost everything else, was reportedly both frustrated with Patton for the confrontation and privately sympathetic to his position. Ike knew Patton was right about Market Garden's failures, knew that the operation had been a costly mistake, But he also knew that managing Allied relationships was crucial for the war effort, and that Patton's confrontational style, however justified in the moment, made that management infinitely more difficult. Now, what makes this story absolutely critical to understanding both Patton as a historical figure and the broader dynamics of World War II leadership is what happened in the weeks and months following this confrontation. Because this wasn't just some isolated incident that got forgotten in the chaos of war, no. This moment had real consequences, revealed deeper truths about Allied command, and actually influenced strategic decisions going forward. In the immediate term, Patton's defense of American competence and his public dismantling of the attempt to blame Market Garden's failure on American forces sent shockwaves through the command structure. Officers who had been present at that meeting told the story to others, and it spread like wildfire through both American and British headquarters. Among American troops and officers, Patton's status as a defender of U.S. military honor was cemented even further. His men already loved him and feared him in equal measure, but this incident reinforced why they followed him, because he would fight for them not just on the battlefield, but in the conference rooms and command posts where reputation and respect were won or lost. Soldiers talk, man, and word got down to the enlisted ranks that old blood and guts had gone to bat for them, had refused to let some British officer disrespect American sacrifice, had stood up for the American way of war against European condescension. On the British side, the reaction was more complicated and more nuanced. Among the enlisted ranks and junior officers who had fought in Market Garden, there wasn't really any disagreement with Patton's assessment. They had experienced firsthand the flaws in planning and execution, had watched their friends die because of intelligence failures and logistical impossibilities, and many of them privately agreed that the operation had been poorly conceived regardless of how bravely it had been fought. These soldiers didn't take Patton's comments as an insult to British military capability in general. They took them as a fair criticism of a specific failed operation and a justified defense against an unfair accusation. But among the senior British command, particularly in Montgomery's circle, Patton's confrontation was viewed as another example of American arrogance and Patton's own impossible personality. Montgomery himself, when he heard about the incident, and he definitely heard about it, reportedly dismissed it as typical Patton theatrics, though those close to him said he was privately furious at both the criticism of his operation and the implied comparison between his stalled offensive and Patton's earlier successes racing across France. The rivalry between Montgomery and Patton, which had been simmering since North Africa and Sicily, intensified significantly after this period, and it influenced strategic decision-making for the remainder of the war in Europe. Here's where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Eisenhower's response to this whole situation reveals his genius as a coalition commander and also his limitations as a pure military strategist. Ike called Patton in for a private meeting, no witnesses, just the two of them, one-on-one. What was said in that room has been the subject of historical speculation and debate for decades, with various accounts based on what both men said afterward to confidants and what can be inferred from their subsequent actions. The consensus among historians is that Eisenhower probably did two things in that meeting. First, he almost certainly chewed Patton out for creating an incident that complicated Allied relations, for letting his temper and his pride get the better of his judgment, for making Eisenhower's already impossible job of managing coalition politics even harder. Ike was genuinely committed to Allied unity, believed it was essential for victory, and saw Patton's confrontational approach as damaging to that unity, regardless of whether Patton was right on the merits. But second, and this is crucial, Eisenhower almost certainly also acknowledged, privately and off the record, that Patton was right about Market Garden, that the operation had been flawed, that American forces had performed admirably and weren't to blame for its failure. Some accounts suggest Eisenhower admitted to Patton that he regretted giving Montgomery priority for the operation, that he wished he had let Patton continue his advance instead, that the decision had been driven more by political necessity than military wisdom. What happened next in the actual prosecution of the war is telling. After Market Garden's failure, Eisenhower's strategic approach shifted noticeably. The single-thrust strategy that Montgomery had advocated was quietly shelved in favor of a broad-front approach that gave multiple commanders, including Patton, the resources and authority to advance on their sectors. Patton's Third Army received increased fuel and supply allocations, allowing him to resume offensive operations. By November and December of 1944, Patton was back in action, besieging Metz, crossing into Germany, pushing toward the Saar region. And when the Germans launched their desperate counter-offensive in the Ardennes, in December, the Battle of the Bulge, it was Patton who performed what many military historians consider the most impressive operational maneuver of his career. Disengaging from offensive operations, wheeling his entire Third Army 90 degrees north, and relieving the besieged American forces at Bastogne in a matter of days. That maneuver, that flexibility and speed of response, vindicated everything Patton had been arguing about American military capability and competence. It was the kind of operation that the British officers' comment about American stupidity made laughable in retrospect, because what Patton accomplished during the Bulge required not just courage, but extraordinary intelligence, planning capability, logistical mastery, and tactical brilliance. The long-term legacy of this confrontation extends far beyond World War II itself, and tells us something important about American military culture and American national identity. Patton became, in the years and decades after the war, a symbol of a certain kind of American assertiveness, of refusing to accept criticism from those who hadn't earned the right to criticize, of defending American honor and American soldiers against anyone and everyone, regardless of politics or diplomacy. The incident fit perfectly into the Patton mythology, the general who spoke his mind, who didn't play political games, who put his soldiers and his country above everything else, including his own career prospects. And there's truth to that mythology, even if the full reality of Patton was more complex and more flawed than the legend suggests. What happened in that briefing room when a British officer questioned American intelligence and Patton responded with overwhelming force, verbal rather than physical? But force nonetheless became a touchstone story, a moment that encapsulated everything Americans wanted to believe about their military and their national character during the greatest conflict of the 20th century. Before we wrap this up, I want to bring this back to you, the viewer, because history isn't just about what happened back then, it's about what those events mean for us now, what lessons we can draw, what truths remain relevant across the decades. If you've made it this far in the video, then you clearly care about these stories, about understanding the real personalities and real drama behind the history textbook summaries of World War II. So here's what I need you to do first. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we're bringing you more stories like this, more untold moments, more deep dives into the personalities and incidents that shaped history. Second, drop a comment telling me what you think about Patton's response. Was he right to confront that British officer so aggressively? Or should he have kept quiet for the sake of Allied unity? Was this a moment of justified defense of American honor? Or was it unnecessary drama that complicated the war effort? I genuinely want to know what you think, and I read every single comment. Third, share this video with someone who loves history, especially military history, especially World War II history. Because these stories deserve to be told and retold, remembered and discussed by new generations. The story of what Patton did when that officer said Operation Market Garden proves American stupidity is ultimately a story about respect, about reputation, about refusing to let your people be diminished or dismissed, about standing up for what you believe even when it's politically inconvenient. Whether you think Patton was a brilliant military mind unfairly constrained by timid superiors, or a dangerous egomaniac whose personality caused unnecessary problems. You can't deny that in that moment, he was authentically, uncompromisingly himself, and that's something worth remembering. The greatest generation faced challenges we can barely imagine, fought enemies of unimaginable evil, and did it with courage and determination that secured freedom for the world. Officers like Patton, with all their flaws and all their brilliance, were part of that story, and understanding them in their full complexity makes the history richer and more meaningful. So thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these stories, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll dive into another incredible, untold story from World War II. Until then, remember the sacrifice, honor the service, and never forget that freedom isn't free. It was bought with American blood and American courage by soldiers who deserved commanders willing to fight for their honor just as fiercely as they fought for victory. God bless America, and God bless the heroes who made victory possible.